Hello, everyone. It's Tuesday, March 5th, and this is Hoot number 68, I think. If I had the thumbnail open, but then the video started playing, and I was like, oh, I forgot what the number of the episode is. But it is episode 68, and today I'll be talking to James Isle. He's a field engineer, and what he'll do is he'll cover the technologies that are clearly winning in their spaces. So Istio, ArgoCD, Envoy. So we'll discuss the emerging trends of moving away from just DevOps towards platform engineering, the rise of dev experience, API gateways, and some common traps when doing lift and shift, not using CNCF tech to move away from old methods, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of interesting stuff. How are you doing, James?
I'm doing well. My name is James Isles. We changed our title recently and I keep on forgetting. I'm a solutions engineer. I used to be called a field engineer. It's
Ah,
kind of arbitrary to me, but I've been here at Solo for about a year and a half. Prior to that, I was a staff SRE at Quizlet for 4 years. I put Istio into production there. Ran the VM to Kubernetes project, ran a lot of meetings there to kind of get us onto Kubernetes, change the monitoring, there's a bunch of other stuff. And prior to that, I worked at Proofpoint. It was CloudMark and it was acquired. Did Kubernetes work there. I've been doing SRE work for about a decade, and a decade prior to that, I was doing more developer work, iOS applications, a lot of PHP, unfortunately, some old Cold Fusion, etc. I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. Big companies. I worked for NASA for 4 years. Worked for Bank of America. Proofpoint was very large when I worked briefly worked there, and a lot of small startups, which I tend to prefer. And so that's kind of my background. Now, why the heck would you want to listen to me about any of this stuff, right? So about a year and a half ago, I had an offer on the table to go work as essentially a staff SRE for a very large OIDC company. You could probably guess which one. And I had an offer from Solo, and I got into a meeting with Edith Levine, our CEO, and she laid it out for me. She said, "Look, what do you enjoy about your career?" And I said, I like understanding how infrastructures work. I like building them better. I like understanding how people do things and why, and then making it better, right? And she said, well, you could go work for that other company and you'll see the inside of one infrastructure for the next umpteen years. Or you can come work for ours and you'll see the inside of dozens, ones that you would never ever even get access to otherwise. You'll see the inside of more infrastructure setups and the way people do things in 1 year than you will in the rest of your lifetime. And she was right. In this last year, I've seen the inside of several large banks, a lot of data providers, some federal government work, a bunch of security companies. I could list on and on and on. I have NDAs with a lot of these, so I will talk obliquely about what they're doing without using their name because I don't want to also throw anybody underneath the bus where they're doing something a little silly because some do and some don't. But one of the things that I've learned is it's interesting to see that trend in that last year and a half of where the discussion started and ended a year and a half ago and where they're starting and ending now because it has changed quite a bit. And some of this is internal bias. I work for solo.io, which means the conversations I have with these companies tend to revolve around things like service mesh or gateways because those are products we offer, right? Or in services that we build out. I hear a lot about Istio, obviously, because I work for a company that contributes heavily to Istio. That being said, even outside and out external conversations to this company, I see certain trends that are pointing in the same direction as the ones that I see as this company goes in the direction that this company's going in. So yeah, some of those trends, some of these trends, the biggest one that some of the biggest ones I'm happy to see, really happy to see. I'll start with what I love seeing and kind of end with what's one of the things I don't like seeing. Everyone's kind of moving towards zero trust and an actual real security posture. I think a lot of companies, including ones I worked for, and I've made this mistake as well, you rush to Kubernetes because that's the thing everyone wants to do. And whether you like Kubernetes or not, it doesn't really matter. The mind share is there. The community is there. You want to hire people that are good SREs? Well, they're going to want to work on Kubernetes. So it's kind of a moot point whether you should be going there or not for a lot of people. Most of them should be, in my opinion, especially if you want to break Conway's law and build out microservices. You kind of don't have a good choice. you're not going to go to Mesosphere and you're not going to do it on VMs. So
Mm-hmm. And
you're going to go to
we're talking about big enterprises here, right? We're not basically saying if you're a startup of like 2 people and 5 users to go and like adopt Kubernetes.
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, even
Listen, that now that I sounded it and heard myself saying that, I mean, it kind of could make sense, right? Because it might be easier from a
so
certain
3 years
standpoint,
ago or
right?
4 years ago, I would absolutely agree with you because the complexity of Kubernetes was too high. And now the community has rallied around it so much. Here's a good example. When I went to learn Kubernetes, I pulled up Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes the hard way. Everyone goes through this. It's like the hazing ritual of Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
And I like when I go to actually build out Kubernetes, what do I build it out in? I build it out in GKE or I build it out in AKS or EKS. And all of that stuff that I learned, valuable information, doesn't really come into play because I'm not doing it the hard way anymore. Or if I, it used to be if I wanted to spin this up on like a local machine, right? You use kubeadmin, and you build it out. It's super easy. Now I build a kind cluster, and it takes like 2 seconds. So the complexity barrier is like so low now that even a small startup, I think it's worth. If nothing else, you kind of get the easy scaling out of the way. I would think I would still look to do Kubernetes.
But that's assuming you have the know-how, right? Like
right.
People know how to do it. And just to the point of when you said I can run kind on my laptop, it's so much easier. Reminded me of years ago. I was doing a lot of workshops, and one of the prerequisites that we always said is like, make sure you have Minikube installed, and make sure you have like 16 GB of RAM at least, to run it comfortably. Those things are gone today, right? Because like kind is so much like slimmer, faster, better, I guess, right?
It's literally like brew install Docker, brew install kind, or brew install K3D, depending on what flavor you want to run. Or you can run kubeadmin, and that's pretty much all you really got to do to get yourself running.
Yes.
I would say if you're a small startup, maybe you start with a monolith in Kubernetes, which is variously some shades of ugly, but maybe okay. But still, like that's better than it's better than trying to figure out a bunch of VMware stuff, especially now. And I'll get more on what's happening with that part of the industry. But or maybe you build on Proxmox, maybe VMs are the right answer to you. Like it's going to be different for every company, but I think more and more people are just going to like, even a small company, like, look, and actually to bear this out, some of the things I've seen from small companies is they started in the last 2 years, they never even touched VMs. They're like, hey, our whole pipeline, we brought in people that were fairly senior. It's built Jenkins Argo, and we are on Kubernetes. We're not even going to try and do scaling VMs or a monolith. We're going to try and get it right the first time, which is very difficult in my mind. But like that is the direction I think people are going, and it's getting easier and easier and easier. And you start getting like you never, and I guess you speak this with the experience. You don't want to be on the dying side of a technology. I was on Cold Fusion back when it was dying. That wasn't fun. There was no community behind it. I was on LAMP stacks way too long. Everyone had moved on to Python, and I was stuck over here on PHP. And I remember collecting data on like who was hiring on what, and because that's a general way of understanding of like where the rest of the industry is going. And I was like, Python jobs are basically outrunning PHP like 10 to 20 to 1. And maybe it's time to get off this and move towards something else, because otherwise I will have excellent PHP skills in a world where no one wants PHP. And thankfully I did. I went on to Python Go, and then I went on to, more SRE work. But that was, definitely something I had to keep an eye on. And anyway, to bring this back to, the things that I love seeing about some of the things that have happened, like Kubernetes is now mature enough, people are start thinking about security. They don't just think of Kubernetes as the final kind of front door. I've had several companies that wanted Spire with Istio, and in the last, or when I bring it up, they know what Spire is and they're interested. In fact, I worked with one of our companies actually has Confluent running with Istio. It was one of the reasons why they came to us, because they knew that we could help them with it. And a year ago, I don't think I was at the Cloud Native Security Con. I don't think most people knew what Spire was. That wasn't even on their radar. So that's nice to see. I think that's a huge. It's going to be a larger and larger thing as people realize that Kubernetes is great, but it isn't by design a security apparatus. You can run what you want, what you need to, and there's levels that you get with it, but it's not the all and all. And so more and more security teams are going, hey, I want zero trust, and which is great if you run a service mesh because you kind of get a really easy route to it.
Mm-hmm.
Or I want MTLS. I want to have I want to limit my blast radius and think about how my traffic works. And so that's great in my mind to see because it shows a level of maturity of Kubernetes isn't just the shiny thing that I have now. Kubernetes is my default platform, and now I need to figure out how to get the most out of it and harden it the best way I can. So and it also talks to people thinking more about the network application layer as more than just, oh, I can open up routes and my level of security is writing firewall rules, right? Like that's a very old, that is an old school colo way of thinking of things. Like, well, I put everything into my firewall and now I'm done, right? Like that mentality is shifting. The other trend I've seen a lot of is Istio in production. And again, slight bias. I work for a company that most of the people that talk to us, they want to talk about Istio. But by the numbers, that's happening more and more. And when I speak to people that you don't even know what solo is, or they tend to know what Istio is, or have some plans around it. And I think that's only going to increase with ambient mode. I'll talk more about that later. But yeah, I think it's good to see. For me personally, there is this promise of Kubernetes and microservices that doesn't come to fruition until you have a service mesh. And what I mean by that is you get off of VMs and you get onto Kubernetes, or you're a company that was Kubernetes native first, and that goes really well for you. But then you're like, I really don't like my service owners writing out observability tools, and I really, and this has bitten a couple of companies I've worked with in the butt, including my own. I really don't want my service owners writing things like retry logic at the application layer. And it's not that I don't need retries. You still need retries. You still need traffic control. But more and more people are realizing, like, well, we should definitely get that out of the application layer into the network layer. Get this away from our service teams. They should not even know or think about this. They may have some opinions about it, but they shouldn't be the ones controlling it. Because what happens is, especially with retry logic, eventually something goes wrong and you DDoS yourself. My company did it. At least 2 other companies I've talked to in the last 6 months have done that to the point where they had outages. And the poor SRE on the other end that's getting paged by over and over again, they don't have any control past redeploying the application with a different retry check, which means you have to go through the Jenkins pipeline, you have to go through everything. It's really painful. Whereas in Istio, you're like, well, I'll bump the retry limit to this, or I'll literally route around the service that's going poorly. There's a lot of ways that this can happen.
It's a config change, right? It's a config once you're in Istio, right? It's a config change versus a config change in an app that potentially requires restarts and or rebuilds, right?
It's a 5-minute change in a YAML file that everyone can understand versus hunting around for the retry logic in an application that you probably don't know that well or that intimately as an SRE, and maybe you're a good programmer. I was okay. I could usually find that stuff at a decent rate. Now I have to figure out how to change it. Now I have to figure out how it gets deployed, because maybe it's different for every service team, and I have to get that approved and deployed, and maybe I don't have approval permissions in the right spots in Git because I'm not supposed to. So it's like, it can be real bad. So I'm glad to see that.
There's way more assumptions one has to make when doing something like that versus like mesh. Let's just set it. First of all, let's just set it mesh wide, for example, right? Have good defaults per namespace per app, however you want, right? And then in the end, you still have to make decisions, you still have to make a change, but it's a less riskier and easier change to do at that level without even touching the application necessarily, right?
And your rollback process is, I just undo my last Git push to a YAML file again. So like, even if you make the mistake and you somehow make it worse, which is somewhat unlikely, you can just get back out of it real quickly. And not only that, but you also, because you have a service mesh in place, you have all the observability you need to know why it's going wrong. And this is something that happened when we put service mesh into production, was the realization that it's not always the service owner's fault. Sometimes you get upstream failures. Sometimes the thing that's calling your service times out and kills your connection. And without Envoy telling you upstream versus downstream connection failure, that's really hard to debug. And you won't. And if you're relying on your service owners to add observability into their own application to try and figure it out, they can't. They don't. They can only see their part of the world. They won't know. Like, it's really, really difficult for them to do that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm glad to see that. I do feel like the day after you get Kubernetes, two things happens. One is someone else builds another cluster. And this is borne out in every company I've talked to so far and the ones I've worked at, where you finally get one good cluster and someone somewhere, cough, data science team usually, is building out another one for some other application or reason. And now you need to figure out a way for those to talk to each other. And then you need a service mesh. That's the second thing that happens, right? That at least that's borne out for a lot of companies that I've talked to, big, small, legacy, non-legacy. Like it just kind of the natural progression of things. And then eventually you get to really large scale, and you're talking hundreds of clusters with some of our customers, and then you have new different scaling problems that Istio can tackle, or Istio has to solve in its own way. So yeah, that's been great to see. I feel like I've bet part of my career on Istio, so I'm glad to see that it's doing well, right? I mean, on a personal level, like that's a big chunk of the reason why I'm here. I really believe in Istio, and this is a company that contributes to it. So the other neat thing I've seen that, again, this goes back to Kelsey Hightower's talk and his opinion of the way some of the software should be. It should be as opaque as possible, and the rise of DevX has made that to a point where if you're running Backstage and you really have a complex environment, or you're like Adobe and they have the Ethos platform, if you want to read a good white paper on it, there's one that's out there. It's letting your service teams hyper focus on just building out new services and letting them knock them out and put them into production in short time frames, and not have to think about the observability layer, the traffic layer, how it's going to get deployed, all of these other parts. It really is a huge, huge boon, because the last thing you want, and this is, we talk to companies that have this problem where, a service team, they make a change to their service and they can't deploy it for an entire day because it's part of a pipeline that is part of a monolith, or it needs to be checked off by several other groups, versus companies that are very mature at this, where they're like, oh, we deploy constantly. Literally, it takes 10 minutes past the point where you're getting your PR finalized, and now it's in production, and you have all the ability to view it. Like, that's the place that people want to be, which is like where larger kind of Spotify, Shopify, these other kind of like large companies are, and that is trickling down, obviously very much Spotify, because they're the ones who contribute to Backstage. But that DevX concept, I think, is becoming more and more relevant, and it's like. I think Christian posted basically the promise of platform engineering is kind of realized by DevX or DevX teams. Now, I somewhat disagree with that. Depending on the company size, you don't get that luxury. Your platform engineering has to figure out what DevX means, because they have to provide for it. But at larger companies, I think that's become very much true. That where you used to have like tooling and some other strict teams, a lot of them I think are moving towards DevX, because ultimately, when you go to explain to a CTO or a VP of engineering, why do you want to do these things? The answer at some point needs to be to make money, because you're in a business, and one of the ways you make money is accelerating your ability to get to production, freeing up time, and basically making your service teams, your engineers, more efficient, right? You're going to spend a ton of money on engineers one way or another to make a good company. You want to get every ounce of production out of them. So the last thing you want is them sitting behind a queue waiting for someone in a platform engineering or network engineering team to authorize a route or something that's really trivial to them, right? So freeing that up, I think a lot more companies will realize, like, hey, this is how we get maximum value from our engineers, and that's something that I'm also happy to see, because no one wants to wait on that stuff. No one wants to check something in and be like, cool, I'm going to wait until Friday afternoon when my stuff goes to production, blow my weekend away, because even though I checked in on a Tuesday, so yeah, that's another thing I'm really happy to see about. So now we're kind of in the middle of stuff where I'm like, I don't know if this is going to be great or not, the trends I've seen. And this one's specifically about AI, and you and I have spoken about this previously, but it's already getting to the point where there's AI fluff going around, where it's like, well, we have an AI gateway. Do you? What's AI about it? Oh, it can connect AI API endpoints. You have an API gateway. Like, don't call it something it's not. And there is a lot of value in the network level of applications that I think that will prove out for AI over time. But there's already companies that are kind of like, hey, we know there's money here. Let's get our name on it, right? And I'm seeing that more and more. And I'm seeing more and more companies like, well, we do this AI powered stuff. And it's like, well, is it worth the value you're getting? I think Copilot.
It's almost like there's a line, there's a point where at some point you're saying it's, I don't know, it's just a buzzword, right? But there is a point where it is actually like worth it's
Oh
there's
yeah,
worth behind it at certain point, right? But I get your point on the API, like API gateway specifically. It's it's almost like, yeah, all those things like input output sanitization, like rate limiting, adding headers, removing headers, like
yeah.
all those things are well-known problems that API gateways solve
Literally been doing
forever,
that since like
right?
Apache. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Right,
I
it's
mean,
not it's nothing new. It's just applying the same technology to a certain scenarios or trends, I guess, if we want to call it a trend, that are currently popular, right?
I, oh yeah, and I'm not trying to say that having an API gateway or a service mesh that interacts and it works with the rest of your like Kubeflow or anything else
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make a lot of sense. But here's my take on it, and here's where I would be if I was running a company that's going to connect to AI. And we have one that does this, so I know it's fairly bounded in truth. You want to really be able to granularly track and isolate the workloads that are using AI. Maybe they're connected to a
Mm-hmm.
chat GPT or whatever else, and bind them back to the service teams that are using them and the product that uses them. And the reason why is right now, as most companies do, ChatGPT is essentially an OpenAI. They're burning investor money to make this cheap to get people on it, right? It
Mm-hmm.
is the AWS cloud model, drug model of first hits cheap, right? First hits free, but now you're hooked on it. We're part of your infrastructure, and the price is going to ratchet up. So what you don't want to be is in a scenario where you just said all in on AI, everyone can use it. Don't think about how it's getting tracked, whatever, right? And all
Mm-hmm.
our workloads are not isolated, so we don't know which customer is using which,
Yeah.
and because you're going to run into a bill eventually that's just going to get larger and larger because they don't go the other direction. And you're going to want to know who to charge or what to
Mm-hmm.
limit or how to limit. And those are things that an API gateway is fantastic at. Same for an actual service mesh, being able to isolate workloads and say like, look, only you can talk to these clusters if you're like running. And this is at a larger scale where you're like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, you know, I bought a ton of $40,000 A100s and I have them all racked at my colo. I want to know how much of them are being used. I want to know who's using them, and I want to know what value I'm getting out of them, right? Because they're expensive to run, they're expensive to own, and they're expensive to operate, and they're expensive to
Mm-hmm.
buy. So you want to know exactly what you get out of them. And those are places where I think it's, like I said, API gateway and the source mesh are going to be very valuable. And Kubeflow uses Istio in its own way
Mm-hmm.
too. But that's a kind of a different topic on why it's important. But to me, it's like I would absolutely want to have my ducks in a row because there's no way that this isn't going to get more expensive. If you look at like how much it costs to actually physically run these things, people are getting this stuff at a real discount right now to get them on board, and that won't stay that way forever. So yeah, being able to control that is going to be a big deal. Maybe not today, but definitely tomorrow. So yeah, that's kind of getting into like the middle ground stuff. And then another trend I have seen more and more is OTel, and it's interesting because I think open telemetry as a technology is fantastic, and it is something I think the metrics world is needed very sorely. I've come from a background where I was building out like StatsD and Brubeck servers. If you ever touched Brubeck, you're probably unlikely it was a collator. And having kind of this stuff kind of willy nilly all over the place was always pretty painful, but now it's a lot more solid. And um, the unfortunate part is, I think part of the reason why OTel is becoming more and more popular is because people are trying to avoid something that I see as a pitfall which is vendor lock-in.
Mm-hmm.
So people want to go to OTel because maybe they don't want to stay on Splunk past Cisco's acquisition, and who could blame them? And maybe they don't want to stay on Datadog past the point where their bills are now more than it costs to hire one or two SREs to run a Prometheus and Thanos stack along with an open or not open a logging stack, like you use Loki or something else. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a real point where it's like, look, if you're spending $1 million a year on Datadog, you could get a better experience by hiring some people and doing this in house, maybe, or maybe not better, but a cheaper experience that will
Mm-hmm.
satisfy your needs. I mean, and I'm not saying Datadog isn't a great product. I use it. I think it's fantastic, but it is very, very easy to get into a trap where you're getting billed very heavily, especially around cardinality. So I'm glad to see that OpenTelemetry is gaining more and more traction. And if nothing else, having a standard spec for that is so nice, as opposed to just trying to figure it out once again. Like it, the old Bill Gates quote about hiring lazy programmers are the best because they never want to do the same thing twice. And I
Yeah.
absolutely feel that way about this because it's like, oh, do I really want to figure out yet another way to hook into it? They look like, no, absolutely not. I just want to find one that I can use forever, right? So that's been great to see.
Yeah.
So
So
this thing,
just like a 30-second on open telemetry for if anyone watching who's not familiar with it, it's basically a set of, we say it's like a set of SDKs for different languages that are uniform, right? It's the same interface. You write your telemetry code to capture to send the traces, right, and metrics, etc. But then you also have the ability to connect to any backend, right? If I explained that correctly, I guess.
yeah, it's a great standard and obfuscation layer at the
Mm,
same time, I guess is the way I think about it. And I know it's more than that. Please, open telemetry fans, don't get mad at me, but like that's the value I see in it.
yeah,
So yeah. Um, so yeah, I'm happy to see that. And there is one other trend that I'm not happy about seeing, and that is okay. So it's the combined reason or the combined fault of a lot of things that have happened, and I'll talk about that in Pitfalls. But and it's not technically closing source, but it is kind of the constriction around open source projects and some of the companies that we're used to relying on for cheaper free things. And when I say that, I'm casting a very wide umbrella because ultimately it is more and more companies trying to find a way to get returns on the resources they've either spent or the resources that other open source contributors have spent in their place. And the big offender to me on this, or like one of the first ones, was HashiCorp or Terraform. They're them
mm,
changing the license, and I've used Terraform for a very long time. I've very much benefited from it, and I've worked with people that have also done things like contribute to the modules, which is an open source community project, right? So you get this great value of all these people contributing to this with the understanding that it's going to stay open source, and HashiCorp saying publicly it will stay open source, and then them turning around and not making it open source, right? Changing the
mm,
license agreement. Like that to me is a way of saying, well, look, we have all this, we have this great value. Some of it, a lot of it ours. Hashi, it's not like Hashi didn't contribute heavily to Terraform. They absolutely did. And we want to capitalize on it. We have things like TF Cloud. We need more customers. This is our way of directing that flow back, right? And it's tough to see because it's not all of their work. Some of it is work from other people that are not HashiCorp employees, right? So it's tough seeing that. And then you'll see other places where acquisitions happen and the companies also they need to extract the value that they put in. Splunk is going
mm.
to go through that. They already laid off people, but Cisco's like $40 billion. Do you think Cisco's not going to try and get every penny back out of that? Of course they are. So rates are going to go up, and I think the product will probably change. I know their theme will probably change. The same thing is going to happen to Isovalent, which is this open question of what happens with Cilium. And I am on the side, and I'm hoping this is true, that the Cilium open source community is robust enough that it can survive Cisco's acquisition of Isovalent. There are a few things are on the side of that I think will make it true. One is Cilium is contributed heavily or is used heavily by people that aren't just isovalent, right? So
Mhm.
GKE uses Cilium underneath the hood. I talk to a lot of customers that use Cilium for various reasons. It's a fantastic technology and is a huge level above what other CNIs do. So I think that will stay true. But it is a dangerous time to have any kind of open source project that is a solo maintainer, not solo.io, but a
Single,
single
yeah.
company. Yeah, let me make this clear. A single company maintainer open source project.
Yeah.
In fact, this morning I was like, I use Cert Manager for stuff all the times, and that was bought by was run by JetStack.
Just
And
stack, yeah.
fortunately, that is a very open, like that is proper open source. Maintainers are all over the place, all a bunch of other companies. And the trend that I'm seeing though is like if you're a company that is the sole maintainer or you're a company that has gone through an acquisition. Broadcom and VMware is a good example of this, right? Like the cost for VMware now is going to basically kind of 10x if you're in the middle tier. It's going way up. And they pulled the ES6i vSphere stuff. So like you used to learn how to use VMware on that. Now you can't even do that. So everyone's just going to move to Proxmox, in my opinion, but or at least the sysadmins are. And the ones that can't are going to pay Broadcom, right? So like they want their money back out. And Cisco's going to do the same thing with Splunk. They'll do the same thing with Isovalent. I mean, that's their prerogative. They're corporations that want to make money. And what the scary thing is seeing these other companies that are not juggernauts like Cisco, like companies like Buoyant, where they basically changed the Linkerd license to say like, look, you only get major revisions, minor revisions, which are very important to a lot of companies because some of those are CD patches or things that are very critical to them that are breaking bugs. You're not going to get those unless you pay us $10,000 a year per cluster, which I believe is the model. I might be wrong on that, but like, which is also a problematic model in general. Maybe you're a company that has a bunch of clusters and you got to spend $50,000 a year because you're running a complex 3 cluster setup with 2 stage and a dev. Like, is that what you want to do to pay for Linkerd? Like that's brutal. And the fact that it like Isovalent is a open source software that has one company as all their maintainers. If you look at the maintainer list for Linkerd, it's all Buoyant employees, and their charter basically says, well, the maintainers get to decide what they want to do with the license, which means they can do whatever they want, which means they essentially own that software. Whether you've contributed to it or not, doesn't matter. You're not on the maintainer list, and you're not going to be on the maintainer list because Buoyant doesn't want you there. So, it's or Nginx. I worked right across the street from Nginx for a long time, and then they were acquired by F5, and then like their offices kind of just disappeared. And when F5 bought Nginx, I was like, well, you can just start the counter because eventually F5 is going to want their value back from Nginx. Exactly, and how are they going to do that with something that is basically kind of really ubiquitous, very common open source software? Everyone has used Nginx. Like just like if you're old enough, everyone used Apache before that, right? And now I'd say probably everyone's going to start looking at Envoy. At least I think that's a good idea if you're looking at for proxies. And I knew then, I was like, well, they're going to want to get their money out. How are they going to get money from Nginx? Well, Nginx Plus is the answer. And what do they lock behind Nginx Plus? Well, things like FedRAMP compliance, or things like complex monitoring, or some complex ways of updating your application, right? Things that you really want that the open source community could probably provide, but will never be able to provide because F5 owns Nginx. And recently, one of the last core contributors to Nginx, this guy named Maxim in Moscow, basically said, this is no longer open source. They don't let me, they're not letting me patch the things they want to patch. They are moving things into Nginx Plus that should be part of free, essentially. And he started free Nginx. So if you're a company built off of Nginx right now, got to kind of think about where that's going to go, because again, F5 owns it. That all being said, there are plenty of companies that are doing well that are open core or open source companies, Solo included, that aren't going to fall underneath that same trap because they quite literally can't. Like, doesn't matter what happens to Solo, Istio will still be around. Its maintainer list is a lot more than just us. It's us, Google, the community, IBM. I think ByteDance is one of the major contributors. Tetrate still contributes here and there. Like, it isn't just one maintainer. And if I were as an active SRE and making these decisions, every single technology I would think about bringing in-house, I would look at the maintainer list and go, hey, is this just one company?
Does it skew? Does it skew to one, or is it like diverse in terms of all the different companies and contributing to the project?
Are they selling basically future closed source? And there's I think you'll have to link it because I'm not logged in, but if you can link that article from the open source.net, this is the
I'll post that one.
The
why single vendor is the new proprietary.
Is a new proprietary, and that's guy from someone that is higher up in the open source community than most, and it's an interesting take on it to see that kind of evolution. So those are some of the trends I'm seeing. Like I said, some are really positive. Like
someone like this and someone down, right? Like plus or minus.
And then some of the pitfalls I'm seeing. So like again, I've talked to probably 24 different companies and seen the inside of their infrastructure. Most common pitfall I see, and I hate to see it every time, hair pitting. Everyone
explain what hair pinning
I'll explain what hair pinning is, right? So hair pinning is when you have a service to service call, or even just like a VM to VM call, and instead of going east west across your infrastructure or directly to it, You go all the way out either to your LB or some people all the way to the internet, and then you go all the way back down. So it kind of makes this hairpin. Kind of, if you look
It's
at it.
like if I do a stupid analogy, I'm good at those. If I'm in my bedroom, hairpinning would be, and I want to go to the kitchen. Hairpinning would be me going through the whole house, outside, coming back in again, going to the kitchen versus just going directly to the kitchen, right?
Yeah, the better analogy is like I was sitting in bed next to my wife, and I call her on the phone instead of just
Okay,
talking to her. Right?
yeah, exactly.
It's like
That's a
she's
good
right
one.
there.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah,
yeah, and,
yeah,
and
yeah,
it's a very common problem, and it's a trap that I think a lot of people fall into because it's very easy to do. And what I see a lot of companies do is they either have multiple VPCs and they don't find a way to bridge them, which is a
mm-hmm.
common and somewhat difficult problem to solve. For those that are not used to this at really large scales, one of the biggest problems is you run into CIDR block and IP contention because VPC-A is using all your 10 block and VPC-B is using all your 10 block. So what happens when you try and peer them through like GCP? Well, it doesn't work because you have contention over what they have, right? Or you have some level of IP exhaustion because of this, or various other reasons, and like, or so maybe you make a VPN tunnel, or you use a service mesh. There's various solutions to it, but that is a common problem. The other one I see is um, you've moved to Kubernetes and you have old VMs, and you instead of building out an API gateway or setting up your ingress the right way, you just say like, look, I'll just call this at all the way at the LB level because that calls back into Kubernetes, right? So as opposed to going east west, it's like I'm going to go
Mm-hmm.
all the way out. Sometimes again, all the way to the internet where they're like, call company.a.com / API endpoint / this, and it's like, well, that is really just kind of the worst thing you can do. The reason why it is so bad, and I should describe this in detail, is for every single hop you're going up and down that chain, that is an increase of latency, and that is an increase in egress and ingress costs.
Mm-hmm.
And you do this for long enough, and both of those things really wreck your infrastructure to the point where you're spending a ton of money on ingress and egress, like orders of magnitude more.
For something that you could basically do if you would just go direct, right, and solve that problem.
Exactly. Something that is essentially free if you kind of architect it a little bit better, and it usually isn't that painful to fix. It just has to be understood, and then you have to kind of think about the way you want to do this and the way you want to scale up for that kind of typical problem. But yeah, I see that a lot, and it always kind of makes me sad because people know about it, but they don't have it. Sometimes it's hard because it's legacy software and you don't want to change routes, or there's usually some other reason why it's difficult, but it's like, oh man, it's tough to see burning cache and burning latency on something that is very, very fixable. The other thing I've seen a lot of, and I admit, I don't know if I'm just unlucky on this or what, but a lot of people have thought it was a good idea at some point to just roll and build their own API gateway. And Louis Ryan, who's the co-founder of Istio and built the gRPC, he's our CTO. He made this comment: "Is like, you could build a proxy in a weekend, but if you want to build a service mesh, it's going to take a lot longer, right?" It's paraphrasing, but that's what I've seen. Is like someone will use like some other reverse proxy, or they built some weird stuff off of Nginx, or they built their own weird Java gateway. And again, I'm not going to mention companies. These are all real things that I've seen. Or yet another reverse proxy YARP, which is a cool one I saw. And they built it, and they have it working in production. And now there's kind of two problems. One is it doesn't do everything that they want it to do because it takes a bunch of engineering time, and no one actually really wants to work on it because who wants to build out an OIDC connector for the nth time or whatever, right? Like, or who really wants to mess with it because it is a critical piece of infrastructure that you can't break, and maybe it's written in a language that you don't have a lot of engineers working with anymore. Cough, Java. So yeah, like I've seen that, and it's like, look, obviously I work for a company that sells an API gateways, and I'm not trying to sell you on Glue Gateway, but we have an open source version you can go check out, or you go talk to somebody to do it. Please don't do it yourself and think that, oh, well, this is just going to last forever. You're going to want stuff. And even if you don't know that you need it, talk to someone about what you can get from it. So like when I have these conversations about Glue Gateway, it's like, yeah, yes, you get all these things that you need. You need OPA, you need OIDC, you need an API gateway to actually handle these. You need routing, all these other security kind of things. but you probably also might want GraphQL the next 2 years. You probably have some WASM and WAF filters that you want to think about that you do not have the ability to do right now, because building out that stuff is difficult at best. There's probably some CVEs and other things that you don't want to have to patch constantly because you built it off of something else, right? There's a lot of reasons to really think about that, buying it from someone else. And in general, if your choice is having a small team work on a gateway or buying it off the shelf, it's probably going to be cheaper to buy it off the shelf, and you're probably going to get
unless you're in the gateway business, maybe, right?
Unless you're in a what?
Unless you're in the gateway business, right? Then it would make sense, right?
Okay. Yeah, if you build gateways for a living.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Right?
Exactly. But otherwise,
sure.
kind of. And I don't know what the reason for it is. I mean, I could think of a couple of reasons. Like for me, one would be, well, it's enjoyable to work on new projects and starting something from scratch, and well, we can build it better, right? I think Kelsey Hightower at some point said something to the effect of, everyone wants a platform, everyone wants a SaaS, but they don't want the one that they didn't build. They want to build it themselves, which is true.
I've been guilty of this. Like, there's been times where I'm like, I could either use this library or I could just kind of build my own. I gotta build my own, right? I'm
because
gonna be
it's
cool.
fun. Because it's fun, right?
It's fun.
I think that's the part of it. Like, it's fun to to start these projects, to work on these projects. But then, realistically, if that's not your core and or main business, just buy it, right? Like, why would you create your own gas out of crude oil if you could just go to the gas station,
Well, and that is, in my experience, there's always this level of tension that a engineering organization has to maintain, where they make the decision to either use something off the shelf or roll their own. And the tension is generally, engineers are going to want to kind of build their own, because that's why they're in the game. Like, that's the fun button, right? Like, and that is something that always has to be thought about. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why, that is a positive thing to do sometimes, and a negative. But ultimately, I think a lot of engineering organizations have to realize that if it's not part of our core purpose, we probably shouldn't be in the game of doing this, right? And that sometimes that's a hard conversation with some of your engineers who are like, well, I really wanted to do this, I had my heart set on it, and like, yes, but that's a bad idea. Like, you shouldn't do this.
I mean, the other reason would be if you really have a very niche and specific scenario that only applies to, like, you and maybe 3 other people or 3 other companies.
Yeah, right? And you'd be surprised at how many companies find new niches as to why they need it when they don't. That's the other thing.
Well, those are fake niches, probably. At that point,
like, we're so special. We do 10,000 queries per second. I was like, companies are doing 100,000 per second. You're not that neat.
Yeah. So basically, the guideline here is make sure, like, evaluate what's out there before you go and build. And if I was picking, like, not just the gateway, but in general, like, picking a tech, make sure it covers everything you need, but also make sure it's kind of future proof as well. If you want to add stuff later, which, if I tie it back to Envoy, for example, right, it's highly extensible. You can do WASM, you can do the external processing, you could tack on and put on additional functionality later if you want to, right? And then also the other thing that you mentioned is, don't get, like, make sure it's not a single vendor.
I was going to say, like, the next thing I was going to say was the hidden vendor lock-in that happens now. And when you go to look at a gateway or anything else, look at what the core technology is built off of. Hopefully it's being built off of Envoy or some other proxy that is open, or some other tunnel, or some of the components are like things like Cert Manager that are truly open source, that have many maintainers, or anything else. And while you may be paying a company that builds on top of that, if their core is open source, you don't have to worry about one day them basically getting the rug pulled out from underneath them, and they're no longer built off of, like, true open source, right? And then they're going to incur costs, which are going to go right to you, right? And this is kind of the problem with what I see with what current vendor lock-in looks like right now. It used to be vendor lock-in was like, oh, I went to AWS, I'll never leave AWS, and that's going to be my life. I invested in API Gateway or Aurora, and I'll never be able to leave because this is the only thing I'll ever do. And that was always dangerous. Now we see more companies that are like, I'm going to be multi-cloud. I'm going to stay out of this a little bit. Lambda was one of those things like, oh, everyone just wants to use Lambda. And then people started using it. Like, this doesn't work that well and it costs a ton of money. And serverless is like cool, but maybe not as cool as everyone thought it was. And that kind of fizzled a little bit. Like, and but if you were locked in, you were really locked in. The new lock-in I see now isn't just from cloud. It is from vendors, and there's kind of two things, and clouds, and there's kind of two things that I see. One is companies that have built things off of open source. And I'll give you a good example. Azure has Azure Istio, right? And a little background with Microsoft and Service Mesh. This is like their fourth swing at doing a Service Mesh, and they've kind of failed in various ways of their previous versions. And they've even partnered with us on this before. So now they have Azure Istio, and I looked at it 6 months ago to understand basically its opposition research. What do they actually provide? And it wasn't much. It was a beta in their defense. And it just really was like, oh, you can install Istio by running a bunch of commands using our gateway, and but it limits you to a bunch of stuff, and it has to be our images. And I was like, okay, cool. So this is like the worst of all worlds. I'm stuck with your Istio. I have less features than open source, and the complexity between this and open source is essentially identical. So I don't even get a simpler installation. All I get is basically you saying that these images will run on EKS. Well, big whoop. Or sorry, AKS. Like big whoop, they all run on AKS. Open source runs on AKS, right? So now they've gone to GA, and I kind of reevaluated what they have, and they're like there's this valley, like there's on this side there is the kind of Kelsey Hightower. It's opaque. You press the button, you get it, right? Like, which is what I think a lot of software wants to go towards. When he worked at Puppet, I think that was his goal. And then on the opposite side, there's like you have to do a lot of work to make it work. Maybe you have the open source version. You kind of have to have someone that matches it pretty well. And that is to a degree where Istio is. Istio has a level of complexity that is difficult that people need to understand, right? And now they're in the middle. They're like in the worst of both worlds, where it's like, yeah, you can check all the boxes easy, but you have and you have all the lock-in that the easy version has, and then you have all the difficulty the open source version has, because it's like, oh, well, you can do upgrades with their version with Azure's version of Istio. Very cool. Upgrading Istio is difficult. Part of the reason it's difficult is because you have to understand how it actually restarts sidecars and understand how you roll control plane. Well, you now have this thing, but you don't know how they do that. So you're probably going to get an outage when that happens. Also, you've ceded control over a lot of options that Istio has, especially some around MCLS, which is very valuable to a lot of people. And you still have to do all this kind of manual configuration. So it's like they're like in the worst spot as a consumer of Istio in my opinion, they could be. But this is an aspect of vendor lock-in, because if you do write it out, they're getting better. I'm sure they'll make better and better decisions that will be easier and easier. A good example of this is when I first looked at Istio, GKE had an option, a little button that said install Istio. And that was it. That's all they told you. And you're like, oh, this is awesome. I don't got to think about it. This is something they're going to take care of for me. And we had evaluated GKE, Anthos, Linkerd, and we're like, this is great. We have this option. We can go with this. And then one day that button disappeared. And I ended up through we had a TAM with Google, was a technical something manager, I can't remember, basically a line to go talk to people that actually work. And in a conversation with their PM on that project, they're like, we're just not going to do that. And they didn't really give me a lot of reasons why. I think internally they wanted to push people towards Traffic Manager, or they really want to push people toward Anthos, which I think is ultimately their play there. But I was like, cool, so you just pulled this out from underneath me, and now I got to figure this out on my own. And I was like, what would happen if I had gone further in on this? This had been, because that button was there for a while, I could be in production with this, and you could have just removed the button. And that would be a good example of where vendor lock-in can be really evil, right? So, and I know there is some hypocrisy in me saying this, because Solo is a vendor. We sell things that are built off of open source and contribute to open source software. Note, what I'm saying though here is we build things off of open source software. Like, we build things off Istio and contribute to it. That is our value to our customers, is like, we understand where Istio has its limits, and we go past them with our software. We also understand for our customers that maybe they have something that Istio should do, and we have the ability to help them with that, right? So like, that is where our value is, and I'm morally okay with that. I'm not morally okay with Google saying, cool, come use Istio, and then just going, sorry, you got to use Anthos now. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, so yeah, I'm seeing kind of more of that of companies basically taking open source projects that are popular, building into themselves as if they are the sole vendor for it, and then kind of not really doing anything. Like if there are various ways that you could move off of our software and be okay. Like it wouldn't be easy. I'm not going to say that it's easy, but it is possible. Whereas, if you're trying to go from Azure Istio onto OSS Istio, or especially if you want to go from Azure Istio to ambient mode, good luck. There's not enough documentation there to even start grasping how you would do that. And they lock you out of so many things. That's just not going to be a likely possibility for you.
Since you mentioned ambient mode, and we're getting close to an hour, let's talk about some successes that you've seen.
Yeah, I was gonna say
that's a good segue.
I'll skip the last. That was my last pitfall, other than the tax cut thing, and I'll leave that lie. So yeah, some of the successes. Yeah, ambient mode. Oh man, I'm really excited about this. And again, obviously biased, but I'll tell you the feedback I've gotten from other people using ambient that aren't even customers of ours, and one of which was for a very, very large company that has hundreds of clusters. And he said, hey, I looked at Istio 3 years ago, and I said, absolutely not. The complexity of running a sidecar and cost for us was going to be way too much. And now I ran ambient, and they're very, very bullish on it. They really want to get it into production. And he said it's night and day difference. And so for those that are not sure why I'm so excited about this, I'll give you some of my history. So I put Istio into production. One of the things I don't like about Istio, and I even have a blog post about it, is the way you install and ultimately upgrade Istio is not easy, right? Part of it is the Istio operator exists and shouldn't anymore because no one supports it. Part of it is people think you should install Istio with Istio CTL, which you shouldn't. And ultimately, Helm's kind of the best way of doing that. And part of that reason is because of sidecars and some other things that are kind of make that difficult. And when I interviewed with Christian Posta, our field CTO, I said, hey, I'm really excited about Cilium because it would be really cool if you could remove all the sidecars and just run that through the CNI. Now, that's not possible because Cilium does not do L7 traffic in that way. But if you combine an L4 tunnel and a waypoint proxy, which is a bunch of envoys running, you can definitely do that, which is what Ambient's doing. So it's a sidecarless model that I think has a ton of benefits. Upgrading is one of them. The fact that you can turn it on your existing Istio, and because it's using the same CRs, you don't have to reinstall Istio. Crazy. I actually have a blog post I want to write about that because I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to have to rebuild all of Istio just to get ambient. Like, no, you can flip a switch, and yeah, your traffic patterns are going to change, which they have to, but the things that you look at is your request total as is your request total, which is like the name of the Prometheus metric you tend to stare at. Like that's still going to be there. The things that you monitor are still going to be there. The actual routes will convert over. It's really, really cool. And people have done a lot of work to make sure that it's happened, but it's awesome.
So sorry to interrupt you, but like a couple of weeks back, I did a talk on ambient mode, right? And I when I used to do Istio sidecar mode demos, right? It's like, look, I have a pod, like I'm going to deploy it. And look, there's two containers in a pod now, right? You could show it like that, right? But then now when you do ambient mesh, it's like you install it, you label the namespace, and those pods keep running. There's no restarts. There's no nothing. It's like, all right, but how do I prove to people that we actually have like the mesh is there and stuff is working, right? And then you fire up like Kiali or something, and actually show, look, we get metrics, we get the service graph, right? You get mutual TLS automatically between the services, and your apps keep running, right?
It's anything that is significantly technologically complex is just indiscernible from magic. Like that's kind of where I'm at with some of this. It's like, oh, I turned it on and all of a sudden this stuff happened. Yeah, I can't show you how anymore.
Yeah. You know what this reminds me of is, sometimes I think I read it or saw it somewhere, is you go to a website and there are certain things, like you press a button and users expect the thing to take longer, so the websites like on purpose show like a spinner. Show a wait a little bit just so because if it's like this, if it happens in a second, it's like no one's going to trust you that you've actually done something behind the scenes. But
I just did my taxes recently, and I'm 90% sure that some of the things they have are
oh,
those
like the
fake.
checks when they're doing and whatnot.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
yes,
yeah.
those are this. Like, you're not spending thousands of dollars or whatever on CPU cycles to actually make this to take that have this take this long. You have a wait 5, and that's
Yeah,
how long it takes every time. Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Um.
Yeah, so
Uh.
it does, like, ambient does feel like magic, especially when you like install and just enable, like, label the namespace, and magically, right, your services have mutual TLS. You get observability. You can do traffic management, right?
Yeah, you get
Off
all the
the
great
website.
things about Istio, and this is an important thing to understand. Is so the people that built Ambient are the people that built Istio. They
Mhm.
know where all the faults are. They've accumulated over the last 6 years plus all the things that they wish they could have done better, and now they are, which is a really amazing thing. It isn't just a, oh well, we're tacking on a few things. It's like, oh no, we really want to re-architect this so it is as amazing as it can be. And I really cannot state how much of a big change that is. And I mean, we wanted it to come faster than it has. Obviously, every FE and sales engineer, everyone's always like, we really want this, we really want this, because
Mhm.
it is so revolutionary. And
Yeah.
if you look at the general landscape of service mesh right now, Istio's already kind of in the in a longer term perspective, it's kind of going to be the only one left in not too far of a distance. Like Kuma never really got off the ground. Isovalent Service Mesh never really had some of the features that people need from Service Mesh, and also was never really
It's
bought by
not a
too many
service
people.
mesh. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's not really a service, and there's a whole bunch of other reasons you can read blogs about it. But also, it's acquired by Cisco, and that's not what Cisco bought them for. So who knows what they're going to do with that, right? So that one's probably not going to go too far. Linkerd is obviously changing their model and is maybe not looking that healthy and has some other general constraints. So yeah, like it's kind of just Istio, and now it's kind of Istio's bag to hold on to, or game to win. And I think ambient really is the thing that's going to push that over to the edge, and
Mhm.
you'll see it more and more. And from even broader perspective, outside of just service mesh, if you look at the general infrastructure landscape and what's changed in the last 2 to 5 years, obviously the developer experience has gone crazy because people want to accelerate the developers. But within like the internal, way you run your infrastructure, CPU and memory usage has been really ramped up and used more by Kubernetes. Now, no one runs Kubernetes at 100%. You shouldn't, but there's a heck of a lot better than running VMs that don't do anything, right?
Mhm.
Like so that's gone way up. Everything about that landscape has been accelerated by Kubernetes. But the one of the things that is part of all infrastructure. Everyone thinks about infrastructure, and you should always think about it as like CPU, RAM, storage, and network, right? Like that. Those are the things that you think about as an SRE all the dang time. Well, storage is kind of storage has kind of been figured out. Like there's nothing that new to be there. CPU and RAM, obviously Kubernetes takes out quite a bit. Network though has not changed that much. I still run into companies that run their networks the way they ran them in the colo, and that area is ripe for a big sea change. And I think ambient is really going to be the thing that
Mhm.
moves it the most. Obviously, CNIs have changed a lot. Cilium has really shook that up, but even past what that a CNI can do, or what a good CNI with ambient can do. We talk about the cake stack, the Cilium
Mhm.
ambient mode, uh, Kubernetes,
Kubernetes and
Envoy,
Envoy and
Envoy,
Spiffy
and then
Aspire.
Spiffy
Yeah,
slash Fire.
yeah.
Those are all things I think we will see more and more. And this is kind of my prediction. Like that is going to that will
Mhm.
accelerate more and more and be a huge success over the next year. You keep an eye out at Paris. I think there'll probably be some pretty interesting things that'll come from that. I'm especially curious about how the security posture will change over time with
Mhm.
Spire, because that's another technology I think that it's also been like that space in general has been changing a lot, but not in a way that has been too big of a sea change. But I think Spire is going to be a pretty big game changer.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean that is some of the successes I've been seeing is people are taking security more seriously. So you start seeing things like Spire and obviously ambient mode. And more of the industry, and I mentioned this at the beginning, like they're moving past the honeymoon phase of Kubernetes. Like they're on Kubernetes, and it isn't just the new shiny, frontier. It's now, oh, this is our boilerplate. Everyone uses
Mhm.
this. Everyone knows how to use this or has some inkling of it. And it's becoming more and more just this is the de facto way of doing things. I don't think I've run into a company that's even talked about Mesosphere, and I don't think I've really run into that many anymore. I used to talk to more that had, oh, we're just a VM shop and we're looking at Kubernetes. Now I see,
Mm,
oh, we were a VM shop and now we have Kubernetes. It's much more common in the
yeah.
last year and a half. So yeah, I mean that is kind of those are the successes, and again my predictions like that ambient mode, like that's going to be huge. I think again Spire is going to be huge, and I really genuinely think that Istio is going to kind of be the last service mesh standing because there's nothing else really left to challenge it. So hopefully something will. Competition is good in my opinion, but
Yeah.
uh, but I think it's been in that direction for a while, and now we're just kind of seeing it really accelerate. So
Mm.
I think that's probably about all the time you have to have
Awesome. Yeah.
random stuff.
Yeah. We can, like, I know we have a lot of people watching and not a lot of questions though, but if anyone has a question, now it's your time to ask. I think we can, we'll stay on live for a little while because I know uh, LinkedIn has like a 3 minute delay or something. So I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions there as well. Or if you're watching on YouTube or X or wherever you're watching, I just said X
Right.
instead of Twitter, but all right. I guess we're doing that.
You
It,
can
it
you
is X.
can yeah, if you're on LinkedIn, you can ask me questions personally. You can DM me. I don't care. I'll answer questions. I love talking about infrastructure. Like that is a big reason. Again, if you were here for the first
Yeah.
few minutes, like Edith's offer of like, hey, you come here, you're going to see the inside of a ton of infrastructure. She talked a lot of SREs. Very true. And I try and
Yeah.
hold myself to the standard of like, hey, if I worked here, what would be best for me? So
Mhm.
when I see these infrastructures, I often think about, how do we solve some of these problems, whether they're something that our product does or not, or how do they want to solve them? What are their plans? And really understanding that it's really kind of accelerated my understanding of the industry at large. Um, I'll give you an anecdote. Some companies, smaller companies, you can restart a deployment. No big deal. No one's going to even
Mhm.
blink an eye. You get to a certain scale, and I talked to one of our very large customers about this. And like, well, we can't do that. I'm like, well, what do you mean you can't restart a deployment? You're on
No.
Kubernetes. Of course you can restart a deployment.
Yeah.
And their response was, no. Our service owners would never allow us to do that. I was like, well, then how do you upgrade Kubernetes? How do you go to Istio? Like, oh, we have a team. We pull the cluster out of our hundreds of clusters, rebuild it, put the new put the new versions and put it back
Oh.
into rotation. And I was like, yeah, because you guys got that kind of money.
Oh, it's almost like they do blue green deployments at the cluster level, not at the. So they
Exactly.
have a
I mean,
Kubernetes to manage the clusters themselves.
yeah, pretty much. It's like, I mean, it's kind of a mechanical turk because it's a small team that does it. But
Yeah, yeah,
that is one thing I didn't talk too much about because it's almost like just de facto now is IAC and Argo and Flux
yeah.
is pretty much just the default now. Everybody wants this. Nobody. I've never had a customer who's like, oh, I really want a SaaS product. I want a UI I can click through. Not a
Mhm.
single one. They're all like, oh yes,
Mhm.
we assume that you're going to be writing this out in Helm and YAML, and you're going to use some sort of deployment mechanism, and that is
Mhm.
the base that you start at. It's no longer like, oh, well, we're eventually going to build this. It's like, nah, everyone wants to do it this way.
Mhm.
Which is interesting because some of our competitors, especially in the API space, they still have these old interfaces where it's like, great, now you got to hook in your identity provider to this, and then you have to keep track of all these accounts, and you don't have a great paper trail, and you don't have PRs, and you're not really using Git
Yeah.
actions or Git pipeline for this. Like all that stuff seems like really painful to me, and I'm surprised that it still exists as something that their customers want. Sometimes I
Mhm.
wonder if that's what the customers want or if that's what the company that's selling them wants. Like there's a line there where it's like, hey, we're kind of one of the biggest games in town, so you're either going to do this or you're going to not work with us anymore. Like, Apogee, come on, guys, like, be nice be nice to the people that pay you money. But
Yeah.
yeah,
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time. For anyone watching, if you have questions, feel free to post it on LinkedIn. Connect with James. Connect with me. Go to Twitter if you want. Ask questions there, and we'll make sure to answer those. Thanks, James, for taking the time. I hope. I mean, it was definitely useful for me. I'm not that exposed to the field necessarily, and I don't know what's happening. So what we'll probably do is, and maybe let's say in a couple of more months, like later this year, we'll do another one and see if the stuff has changed in any
yeah. I want to
aspects.
I want to see if my predictions come true. Like I really believe that MVMO is going to be a huge deal. I believe Cakes is going to be a huge deal. I'm curious if more people will adopt Spire. I mean, as a technology, I think it's
Yeah.
fantastic, but it is a level of complexity that maybe some security groups don't want to deal with. But yeah, I want to see if I was right or if I was way off base.
If nothing else, we'll do that. We'll check on James's predictions later this year and see how he's how those panned out or not. All right.
Cool.
Thanks, James. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. If you're at KubeCon, solo.io will be at KubeCon as well. We'll have a booth, so stop by, say hi, get some swag. I guess we'll probably have some. And
Solo's got the best swag. Every conference I've been at, everyone likes our tumblers and all that other stuff. We have the best
oh
stuff.
yeah,
I say that. Like Heather Hames runs this stuff, and she's on point. She really gets.
oh
She knows
yeah,
what people want. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. All right. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.